everyone, welcome to another Book Review Wednesday, and today I thought it would be interesting to briefly address a Dan Brown work and not really discuss the famous one, the Da Vinci Code, because that I think has been done to death, and I actually think this novel is superior to the Da Vinci Code, and I think the Da Vinci Code is kind of a little overrated, but again, it's all right. It's good. I just don't think it's as good as this particular book that I'm going to be discussing, and I don't think particularly Dan Brown is as strong of a writer as maybe some other writers out there, but I still think he did a really good job with this book, so I will give him props. And so I'm going to be discussing Angels and Demons. Now, there might be some people who either don't care at all for Dan Brown or enjoy his work. I'm one of those people who felt that Angels and Demons was probably the best, and then it kind of just went downhill from there as far as quality is concerned when it came to, I think, his books, especially the ones where he makes Robert Langdon the center of attention. But this one was the first, so it kind of goes like in a downward direction, I think, ever since really Angels and Demons came out, and I think Angels and Demons was probably at the top. So without further ado, let me sort of address what is within this book and how it is probably unique to other Dan Brown works. This book, I think, is interesting because it has sort of these multiple layers to it when it comes to the plot. It's not just simply it's not, I think, as simplified as the Da Vinci Code. There's a lot more layers to this plot, and a lot more, I think, at stake, actually, than really is present within the Da Vinci Code. But I think the only reason the Da Vinci Code got such recognition was because of the fact that they were addressing some somewhat controversial story, which was the idea that Jesus was married and had offspring. That's the huge thing that people seem to go in circles about, and I think that's why it got so recognized and put into the mainstream. Whereas Angels and Demons was kind of like the second work that usually people think of when they think of Dan Brown. But regardless, it still maintained some popularity, and it did get an adaptation eventually. But I think that was it was pretty much to the point where we really didn't care all too much about Dan Brown and his works, I think, to ultimately give the adaptation a huge amount of credit. So yeah, and it was weird because Angels and Demons comes first, but then they made the Da Vinci Code the first adaptation. So yeah, it kind of his works are kind of all over the place. But basically, I think Angels and Demons not only has a more layered plot, but I think the characters are a little bit more developed here. I think there's a little bit less blandness than there is in the Da Vinci Code. Although it is heavily plot driven, you still get a sense of the protagonists as well as the villain that ultimately ends up being discovered, and he actually has a somewhat more in-depth backstory than I think the villains in the Da Vinci Code had. So you can sort of take that for what it's worth, but I found a lot of the things that were going on within this book were a lot more layered while still at the same time making sense and tying together, and I felt that the story was just a lot more it was just a lot more thriller-y than something like the Da Vinci Code, at least to me. because literally you'll see the protagonists are really literally trying to save as much time as they can so that they can ultimately solve the mystery. But basically, the book Angels and Demons is about Robert Langdon, who is I believe he's a Harvard professor. They call him a symbologist. Apparently, symbologist does not exist as I guess, title for a professor. They just kind of made that up, at least according to one of my math teachers, I think, in high school. He mentioned that symbologist is not something that, universities usually have. But basically, he is called in by the Vatican to solve this growing problem that they're having, which is that not only is the Pope dead, but the Pope needs to be reelected. A new Pope needs to be reelected. And at the same time, some of these reelected popes some of these popes that are going to maybe be elected as the new Pope ultimately end up getting captured. And they sort of feel that Robert Langdon can be a huge asset because apparently the group that is sort of claiming to have taken these supposed popes to be, usually they call them just cardinals, is part of the Illuminati. And the Illuminati has this long history of being very against the church and its sort of teachings, so to speak, especially considering the fact that the church kind of were not really for the Illuminati way back then and killed some of their members and so on and so forth. So as a result, it's basically up to Robert Langdon and this professor, I believe, I don't want to put her title as professor. She's more like just a scientist, who ultimately ends up becoming involved with Robert Langdon on this mission because the group that is claiming to have taken the cardinals also is sort of threatening to kind of blow the Vatican up, unless they can find out where the cardinals are, and where the person that did capture them, or the group of people that were responsible for capturing them, where they can find where the bomb is to where they want to explode the Vatican. And apparently this bomb was stolen antimatter from the facility in CERN, or the facility, I guess they call the facility CERN, and I think it's in CERN, Switzerland. But basically, that's really the plot in a nutshell without really giving anything away. There's just, again, multiple layers of people involved. You have the scientists who are involved. You have Robert Langdon who's involved. You have the church who is heavily involved as well throughout the story. And you sort of see how these groups try to ultimately work together to finally get to a point where they can maybe potentially save somebody, or at least try to prevent the Vatican from blowing up. But that's really the scenario. And they do, I think, emphasize the torture a lot more than the Da Vinci Code, actually, because it is emphasized that the cardinals do suffer extensive amounts of excruciating pain, and the person who captures them really does these things in a very twisted way. And ultimately, when a villain is discovered, he's given a lot of development and backstory, and you sort of see why ultimately he's motivated to do what he ends up doing within the story. And it sort of brings up the similar messages of, faith and science, and except with the Da Vinci Code, it's more about a test of the Christian faith per se, because again, it's focusing on the story of Jesus. Whereas even though the Vatican is a huge primary focus within the story, it kind of puts faith and science on kind of these on this more, like, I guess, higher level. Like it's really about the conflicts between the two, between science and between faith, but not necessarily addressing a particular story within the Bible or talking about, um, different different values, or basically all of the values that really the church in particular emphasizes. It's more about kind of just a test of faith, and a test of science too, since science ultimately ends up making things a lot more complicated, especially considering the fact that science was stolen. So it's really a time cruncher, because they only have a certain amount of time, which you will ultimately see why if you choose to read the book. But really, the biggest emphasis that I think Angels and Demons can provide is that it's supposed to be a look into science and faith, and in doing so, ultimately end up coming to some kind of understanding between the two, and what they mean and how they sort of impact people's lives. So that's really the themes, but I don't think they're as upped as they are within the Da Vinci Code. Like in the Da Vinci Code, they really do emphasize the whole story of Mary and Jesus and all that. But here, it's very downplayed, and it's just pretty general. It's not focusing on one particular story, or trying to disprove certain information. It's just trying to be a fun science versus sort of faith tale, while at the same time science and faith sort of causing great destruction, while at the same time possibly fixing the problems that end up occurring. So that's really what Angels and Demons offers as a book. I think it's just more interesting. It's more, you feel like that there's a race against time. You do feel like you are being absorbed and taken away into what ultimately what the main characters have to go through. I like the fact that Robert Langdon here was really I like how there was a huge emphasis on symbols in particular in this book. Unlike the Da Vinci Code, where you just kind of go, okay, that could be possible, but at the same time, it's like, it's very like, it's the symbols aren't really as interesting, I think, as they are within this book, because in this book they're a lot more, I think, detailed, and they're a lot more descriptive, and they actually lead to different clues, and it does feel like a puzzle piece, and you're sort of putting all of the pieces together until ultimately you have the whole picture, so to speak. Unlike the Da Vinci Code, where it's just kind of going through, okay, we go through here, we go here, and then we go here, and then we go here, and then, okay, big climax at the end. Whereas here, there's a clue. Okay, it's leading me to this other place. Is there a clue? Oh, this is leading me to this other place. Oh, I found one of the cardinals. Let's see if I can save him, So you do really feel like they're really going through a hugely more layered journey. At least that's how I felt when I was reading this book. I felt it to be a lot more intriguing that way because of that particular reason. But yeah, I think that's really ultimately all I can say about the Da Vinci, or excuse me, Angels and Demons. It's pretty thick, as you can see, but if you start reading through it, since the language is not really all that complicated, you could probably get through this no problem. It's not one of those books where it's like Anna Karenina where you open it up and there's like so and so many words. Like when you open it up here, the language is not as um, it's not as complicated and it's not as drawn out. So it really moves by really quickly, at least in my opinion. And I thought it had a lot more interesting layers to it as opposed to the Da Vinci Code. But it's not to say that Da Vinci Code is a bad book. I don't think it's necessarily a bad book, but it's kind of a little. I just think it's good. I don't think it's great. Whereas I think this one was actually the best out of Dan Brown's work. But yeah, I think that's really ultimately all I can say. But again, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.